the webinar. My name is Megan Spencer, and I'm a research assistant at the POLIS Water Sustainability Project, located at the University of Victoria. Our communications director, Laura Brandis, is away on holiday in Europe. Lucky her, so I'm filling in her shoes for the day by hosting this webinar. I'm logged in under her name, so when you see Laura Brandis under the webcam or popping up in the chat box, it's actually me. So today's webinar, A Blueprint for Watershed Governance in BC, is the first webinar in the 2014-2015 Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series, the start of our 5th season. We expect our next webinar to take place on November 26th, and I'll share details of this upcoming webinar after the presentations today, so stay tuned for that. I want to thank you all for being here. I look forward to the ideas and perspectives we'll get to share together. I know some of you have attended our webinars in the past, but for those of you who haven't, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Creating a Blue Dialogue series. So its goal is to bring together water leaders and practitioners in one virtual space to engage with emerging and priority issues in water policy and water governance. And this webinar, as I hope you all know, will explore current water and watershed governance issues in British Columbia, with a focus on some of the winning conditions needed to move towards a more sophisticated approach to watershed governance in BC. The session will close with a broader discussion of the emerging and priority issues and the potential next steps as jurisdictions across Canada seek to enhance watershed management and achieve better governance of their home waters. So we couldn't carry out this series without the support of our various partners. All of them are listed here on this slide. I want to say a big thank you to all of them, and in particular to the Canadian Water Network, as they are our core sponsor for this year's series and for the past few years as well, and also to Water Canada Magazine, who is our media sponsor. So before I hand things over to the speakers, there's just a few housekeeping items I'd like to run through with you. So the first has to do with audio. As I'm sure you've all realized, I have a blanket mute on everyone. Since we're expecting over 100 listeners, this means we won't have any audio feedback chaos to distract us from the presentations. So that might raise the question, well, how will we deal with questions? I see, many of you are using the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen. After both Oliver and John are finished presenting, that's where we'll handle questions. I'll serve as the moderator and read them out as they come in, and Oliver and John will be able to answer them. And the final housekeeping item I'd like to share with you is that I think now is a nice opportunity for you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Maybe give a weather update from your region. It's kind of overcast here in Victoria. Just a nice way to get a sense of the community in the room since we're all scattered across the country. So if you could say who you are, what organization you're with, and how many folks are listening with you, that should help us feel more like a community. So we'll go on to today's speakers. First, we're going to hear from Oliver Brandis. Oliver is an economist and a lawyer by training and a transdisciplinarian by design. He serves as co-director of the POLIS Project on Ecological Governance at the University of Victoria Centre for Global Studies and leads the POLIS Water Sustainability Project, where his work focuses on water sustainability, sound resource management, public policy development, and ecologically based legal and institutional reform. Oliver is an adjunct professor in the University of Victoria Faculty of Law and School of Public Administration. He is a founding member of the Forum for Leadership on Water, which he currently co-chairs, and BC's Convening for Action on Vancouver Island leadership team. He has affiliations at the University of Waterloo, Brock University, and the University of Manitoba. Oliver co-authored the Water Sustainability Project report titled A Blueprint for Watershed Governance in BC, which was published in January 2014 and provided the base content for this webinar. And our second speaker today will be John O'Warden. John is a former Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Sustainable Resource Management in the British Columbia provincial government. He completed 35 years in the public service, mainly with the provincial government in environmental management and land and resource planning. In his most recent position at the Ministry of Sustainable Resource Management, he was responsible for completing 6 regional land and resource management plans. John joined the Water Sustainability Project as a Strategic Water Policy Advisor in 2007, where he focuses on provincial water law and policy reform and the ecological governance of water management. He was also a co-author of the report, A Blueprint for Watershed Governance in BC. So with that introduction to the webinar and to the speakers, it's my pleasure to hand things over to Oliver. Thank you. So you just need to press *6 on your line, Oliver.
Good morning, Canada. So, hi there, everybody. It's always an exciting moment for me because I've been part of, obviously, the webinar series all through its various iterations, and I'm so excited when we have a packed house, and Megan did a fabulous job of getting us oriented and introduced. I'm going to jump into things here. I'm going to start with what I think is a little bit provocative, but it's something that I think we need to take serious, and that is the notion that the future really is shared decision-making at the watershed level. It really is not a question of if, but a question of when. And I think this rescaling of water governance is already happening globally. We're certainly seeing it nationally, and increasingly in British Columbia it's becoming apparent. Now, the big issue or the big challenge is around the notion of moving to this watershed scale, both in approaches and institutions, perhaps, at least in my view, being inevitable, but will it happen as a proactive, preventative, positive step or in response to crisis? And in that case, in the result of irreversible impact. So that's really the context to which drives a lot of the project, and certainly this project in particular. Now, I'm going to start with the 3 key messages. It's always nice that hopefully you'll walk away with these key messages out of this event, and we like to put it up front. And the first piece is the who and how of making decisions about water is complicated. There's no easy answers. There's many levels, many governments involved, different actors, and it really does affect everything. And it's increasingly sort of on the radar. The second key message is that water law and governance will change more in the next 10 years, in our view, than it has really over the last 100. And we're already sort of sliding down that approach. We're seeing the changes happening before our eyes. It's an exciting time if you're into studying governance and even participating and being a practitioner in it. And finally, the idea that we're entering the age of adaptation. The idea that resilience and taking uncertainty seriously are really our only options. We need to be building those social resilience for an increasingly uncertain world. And this means shifting the notion of managing watersheds to managing people in watersheds. And to do that, that means there's going to be different and more players involved. This is part of the major challenge. So here's my overview of what I hope to speak to, and I'm going to set us up for John, who will dive a little deeper in a couple of aspects, give us his very good government perspective, and also grounded in some of the specifics of British Columbia that will set up, hopefully, a dynamic conversation, some questions that you'll have, and a dialogue, really. And it's really important to note that this is the first of our series this year, and the whole series, all 5 of the contributions in the Blue Dialogue series will be built around core aspects of watershed governance. So we'll be exploring different aspects, and I'll sort of go through that in some detail when we get there. But for the overview of what I'm going to talk about, we're going to talk a bit about where we are and this context for change. And for most of you as water people, this will be largely obvious, but I feel it's necessary to provide a bit of that context. And number 2, we're going to talk a bit about governance, what it is and why it matters. I'll then get into those winning conditions, which really is the meat in the sandwich of our blueprint, which really is the bringing together of that research and the identification of practitioners about what are those issues, what are those opportunities that really can make change. And finally, I have to do a little bit of speculation about where we might be going in some of those key questions going forward. So where we are, of course, we all know about the escalating freshwater crisis. Certainly, as long as I've been working in this field, which is almost 15 years now, we've seen this notion of a looming crisis, and some suggest that it's not looming anymore, it has loomed, and we see lots of examples of that. But what makes it really interesting to me is in recent times, we're seeing different actors and different players starting to raise the concern. It used to be sort of primarily seen as your classic environmental problem, but water is now sort of raised up in the broader social consciousness as we see a group, and this is just an example, but the World Economic Forum identifying 3 of the top 10 risks related to water, and they're talking about all the risks, and they're saying that 3 of the top 10 of the global risks are related to water. So that's really a huge change in awareness and the priority that water is beginning to play. Now, we know, of course, there's a number of drivers and impacts of this. The most obvious is climate change, and I think this wonderful quote by Jim Bruce, who said, if climate change is the shark, water will be its teeth, meaning that as climate change impacts happen, we will feel it through the water, and it's really this loss of stationarity or this idea that we're going to be entering whole new regimes where the hydrologic cycle is fundamentally impacted and changed. Of course, with change like that and increasing scarcity and at times floods, what we see playing out is increased conflicts, and that's really where the law and policy and governance components come in, because dealing with conflict, allocating scarce resources is the purview of law often, especially as we deal with entitlements. And what we see is an increasing conflict as the institutions and the incentive processes are no longer able to keep pace with the changes that are happening in the physical world. Of course, I think many of us have heard of the notion of peak oil. There's the notion of peak water. There's the notion of peak phosphorus. There's even a book called Peak Everything. Well, we're going to add one more peak to the puzzle here, and that's the notion of peak government. And that's the idea, and we see it certainly at POLIS time and time again. We witness that communities are facing circumstances and situations where government no longer has the capacity to even follow through on its existing commitments to safeguard the health and function of local watersheds, yet alone taking on those additional roles needed to address the complexity of managing watersheds today as we see all those other changes happening. So this idea of government no longer having the capacity and then largely creating this void where uncertainty reigns and we have unclear processes and an emerging role for civil society and other actors to begin filling that void. At the same time, we are also seeing increased support for the notion of the importance of water. What we see is a uncommonly common consensus around water as a priority. Survey after survey, both national and provincial, show that water is the most important. In this case, this was a recent survey probably about 2 years ago where 93% agree that fresh water was our most precious resource. So we see water certainly climbing in the consciousness at the same time as all the challenges mount. What we also see is the notion that the public intuitively understands that protecting water has something to do with both expertise in science, enforcement and rules, local control. These 3 elements are there. The alchemy, the right ratios of these 3 things aren't always understood, and they are currently in flux as government roles changes, as the hydrology changes, as our institutions sort of struggle to keep up. This is the backdrop of what we're seeing in Canada, certainly an evolving water governance. The history, of course, is the top-down, state-driven regulatory approaches, the Canadian fundamental notion of good government order is beginning to change. What we're seeing is some different experimentations, for example, in Alberta with markets, and more recently an emphasis on collaborative approaches and partnerships all across Canada. In different forms they manifest, but the role of other players increasingly important. And internationally, this trend is certainly mirrored, and it goes yet further where sharing of responsibility and authority becomes important attributes or characteristics. Certainly in Canada, we see evidence of this occurring. Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, Northwest Territories are experimenting in very serious ways about new approaches and models of shared or collaborative watershed governance to better protect water resources. Some, like in Ontario, and I see that many of the participants today are from that area, understand that the conservation authorities have a long and established history, and that's one kind of example. And it really is this fundamental shift from the notion of government to the idea of governance, the broader mix of players. So now let's just talk a little bit about governance. When we talk about governance, we're referring to the complex processes involving both individuals, institutions, civil society that collectively make these social choices. It involves both the who and the how of making collective decisions. It is inevitably concerned with power, the ability to influence, shape, execute decisions, and to hold those making them to account. It has obviously a formal component when we think about laws and institutions, regulations, but it also has this sort of informal character that influences values, behaviors, and norms. And really behind it is this idea of learning and adapting to change, building social resilience to address this increasingly uncertain world. And we really like to distinguish it from the notion of management, where we're really talking about operational, on-the-ground activities, where in governance we're talking about decisions and power and holding those to account. It really is, I think, important to recognize that it's more than just pushing paper around. It has a broader implication, and it really sort of sets the tone for everything. And this is where we get to the idea of power. And this is where I like to use the spectrum of governance. There's a variety of ways you can sort of frame this. And historically, when we've talked about water governance, these broader actors and players, it's been more in this persuasion and indirect influence. And increasingly, we see the more formal approaches where we begin to provide advice to decision makers. And increasingly, we see examples where the decision-making, both the consequences and accountability, are taken on more formally. And just as a shorthand, we like to use the idea of influence, veto, and then control. That's sort of the spectrum we're talking about. And collaborative approaches, I think, are an important component of it, but I really want to emphasize that collaboration is just a tool. It is not the end. The end isn't that we're collaborating but ending up with the same decision. Instead, we're talking about actually making decisions, different types of decisions, where collaboration is an important, arguably critical or necessary tool to get to those decisions. So now let's talk a little bit about rethinking governance in this watershed context. So we know that government will still be critical. So I'm not suggesting that government is gone, but I'm suggesting that their role is changing. That it's broader, that we have this broader group of players that are involved. And of course, this means that new institutions and decision-making processes are likely needed. And that's part of the evolution we're seeing. That there's both formal and informal structures, and our argument certainly at the POLIS project on ecological governance is that scale matters. That there's a legislation and regulatory, there's also persuasive or influence to create this watershed culture, and these pieces need to work together. And ultimately, achieving long-term sustainability requires this shift fundamentally from managing the watershed, so the ecosystem as something separate from humans that we can manipulate, to fundamentally managing our role in the watershed. That's a very fundamental shift. And what we're interested in is the institutional and legal aspects in addition to the social and cultural. So that gives us the backdrop to the blueprint for watershed governance that we worked on. Was a 3-year intensive public policy and governance research. So we did the global literature review, but also we engaged in a number of practical examples all around the world. It led us into 6 key principles, 9 winning conditions, and 12 action items for BC, but many of the themes and concepts are applicable all across Canada. The making of the blueprint, of course, was involved, and we had a number of peer and practitioner reviews, a number of workshops, all working together to get the insights and for us to really harvest the knowledge and expertise that not only exists in the academic community, but also in the practitioner community, those people facing the challenges in real time. Now, of course, we're not suggesting that such a model that we're talking about has all benefits. There are both strengths and weaknesses to such a model. The obvious strengths and opportunities relate to increased social resilience and adaptability. Watershed context and its function become overt in decision making, which currently becomes is sort of secondary. We make many social decisions, but unfortunately, they don't always appear. The ability to leverage expertise and resources can be cheaper in the long run. Finally, this real benefit is the highly collaborative nature. So those affected will have a say, and this is critical to building that public and community confidence. The weaknesses or the challenges obviously are that it involves changing institutions and new legislation, and that can be time-consuming, it can be politically challenging. That requires that political will and the institutional commitments required. Breaking from the status quo is sometimes very challenging. There's also government resources, especially dollars at the upfront to catalyze these changes. And in what we see as a shrinking government world, getting these dollars and resources, even the people power to come out to those events or to be engaged in those reform processes can be very challenging. Transition to a new system increases uncertainty as well, and those are some of the big challenges. So now I'm going to take a deep breath here for a moment. I'm going to let you guys orient yourself as I've given you a mad rush through both some of the context and some of the important elements or some of the contextual thinking. And now I want to change gears a little bit and talk about these 9 winning conditions and to really emphasize that we've sort of pulled these out. They got extracted from this work both in the academic literature review work but also in the practitioner work. And I think when we started, John and I had a sense that we would come up with a very clear menu and we'd have a very clear sense of what these winning or what the conditions were. And what we realized was they manifest in a whole variety of ways, and we actually changed our thinking to move more towards this notion of a winning condition, recognizing that when you put these conditions together, the potential for success was increased. That a winning condition was neither necessary nor sufficient, but when you mix them together, you're more likely to make progress. And so when we looked at the really successful examples internationally and even in Canada, these were the 9 elements that really sort of drew our attention. Now these 9 elements I won't go through in detail. I'm going to introduce you to them. Some I'm just going to highlight. John will offer a few more thoughts when he speaks. And some, and I'll identify which ones, will be the focus of the next of our series in the Blue Dialogues. So some of them will really have a chance to have a deeper dive where we'll bring in some of the experts who are actively living and working in that field to give us some insights. So number 1 in the winning conditions is the idea of enabling powers in legislation. So this is the idea that there is an actual legal or institutional framework within which these watershed bodies or entities who are looking to take on some power, some authority, some formal responsibilities can exist. So they aren't just ad hoc, and it helps build the legitimacy and accountability necessary. And the idea and the language we use is the idea of drawing down powers, which is very different than delegating or downloading. Because drawdown is the notion that it's voluntary and that the entity is bringing on the powers themselves. So the watershed board, authority, or trust might wish these powers because they both have the interest and they have the capacity to take them on. And we give a number of examples where some of the most successful in British Columbia have this sort of legal or institutional backing. And of course, if you look across Canada and internationally, there's examples of this very prominently and often in those places that are facing the most severe challenges first. The most obvious in Canada, and it's very well studied and certainly a model elsewhere, is the idea of conservation authorities, and they have their enabling powers in legislation in the Conservation Authorities Act. So I just want to emphasize this idea is not to create another level of government, but instead to better create this nested system, this idea of what we call thinking like a watershed. So you think of overlapping jurisdictions where bodies like the federal or the provincial or First Nations or municipal or local governments still play a role, but we get more of a nested system where the water or watershed governance pieces begin to interplay. So that's where this notion of creating the legislated body for this nested system becomes critical. Number two is this idea of co-governance with First Nations. And in British Columbia, this is a huge deal. This is a fundamental shift. And when we're talking about co-governance, we're talking about much more than the legal test for consultation and accommodation, and fundamentally more than even the Section 35 constitutional protection of rights and title. It really is about a whole change in mindset. It's about reconciliation and partnership. And what we certainly emphasize is how this manifests will vary from place to place. And it really is about First Nations having a formal role in decisions in the watersheds. It requires that full recognition of Aboriginal rights and title in the context of traditional territories. And it really means that you have to build this relationship over time and right from the outset. And certainly the very recent Supreme Court of Canada decision, the Chilcotin decision, affirms that the First Nations' explicit role in decision-making in traditional territories is not optional. It is going to be the reality going forward, and certainly some of the analysis and understanding of the implications of this case is that it's going to be more than just affecting British Columbia, where the vast majority of territory is not covered by treaty, but it's going to have implications all across Canada where even treaties exist. So the role of First Nations are going to become very critical. Number three is the support from and partnership with local government. The idea that local government is this critical partner as well. And we're seeing lots of examples, and that's in fact where John and I were yesterday up with the Cowichan Valley Regional District, as they are in this process of thinking through how are they going to do watershed governance. How will the regional district, in this case, build those relationships with First Nations and think about their structures in a way that can really benefit and support the watershed. And it's important because the local government partner really brings that local context, the ability to engage the local issues, and access to some of those resources. The ability to draw down powers will be critical to building that local buy-in. Number four is, of course, you can't do any of this without having successful long-term funding. There are many, many examples of watershed-level initiatives that have relied on philanthropy or initial projects, and they usually have this sort of 3 to 5 year timeline. There's a lot of energy, there's an issue, there's some influx of support, there's a lot of volunteer energy, and then what happens is the energy dissipates. And what we need to really think about is this ongoing long-term funding. And we give a list here of a number of different elements of the kinds of funding sources, and it's really about innovative finance. It's about thinking about new sources. And number five is this idea of a functioning legal framework for sustainable water and watershed management. And this is distinguished from winning condition number one, where we talk about the legal framework to enable the watershed bodies to exist. This is about the broader senior level governments, but also local and First Nation or Indigenous laws that set us up to begin protecting our water. So the legal and social norms to protect our water. We've done some research on this and looked sort of globally at what makes in essence, a modern water act. What makes a sustainable water law? And these are the 5 or 6 key elements. And it's interesting because we've done this work in this at the same time or concurrent with British Columbia as it has tried to update its water law. And you can see some elements of what we consider the cutting edge to be represented or reflected in the British Columbia laws, but not all. So the 6 elements that we consider critical to a successful water law are whole system management, also that there's water for nature, that there's legislated environmental flows, and that is certainly reflected in the new British Columbia Water Act, and John will explore this a little more in his comments. Protecting the water cycle. So the idea that it's not just surface water, right? It's rainwater, it's groundwater, there's an interconnection. And historically, in many parts of Canada, well, all of Canada, and over time that's changed, but in British Columbia, we still didn't regulate groundwater. So we were only dealing with a very small segment of the water cycle, which is very unecological. That we're looking at ultimately is, so point number 4 here is enabling the sharing of water and resolution of disputes. And this is where we bring in this notion of the public trust doctrine. And this has been a theme of previous webinars, but the idea that the government or the holder of the water entitlements has a fiduciary responsibility, not just to the current, but also to the future, to ensure that water is maintained in place. The fifth element of a modern water law is that public participation is key, and that those impacted have a say. And in Canada, that really starts with respecting First Nation and Aboriginal rights, but it also can extend into areas of having broad standing to appeal those critical allocation decisions. And those elements are certainly much weaker in the current manifestation of British Columbia's Water Sustainability Act. So that's an area where they have not been able to address what I would consider a cutting-edge water law element. And the final element is this idea of embedding accountability and oversight, that the only way you can have institutions and even legal instruments that evolve over time is that we need that sort of constant feedback. And that's a critical role for oversight bodies like the Ombudsman or a Natural Resources Board to have us understand if the rules that are in play, are they being followed and how can they be better followed. So those were the first 5 winning conditions of the 9. And those will be the focus of our ongoing series throughout this year. We're going to explore co-governance with First Nations. We're going to explore how the different local governments and municipal partners are playing roles in watershed governance. We're going to explore how sustainable funding can happen and occur in place, and some of these aspects of modern water laws going forward. I'm just going to skip that slide, and we're going to move to the final 4 winning conditions, and I'm just going to touch on them. John's going to explore them a little more. I'm going to emphasize a little bit on the last. So winning condition number 6 deals with data, information, and monitoring. And when I talk about information, I'm not just talking about the sort of physical sciences type information, but also traditional knowledge and understanding of the dynamic that has historically occurred in different watersheds and the cultural interplay. We've talked, of course, about the critical role of independent oversight and public reporting. We need to understand what's happening on the landscape, and we also have to have confidence that, people are minding the store or watching when things are changing. And of course, the biggest challenge that we face is not always the big impacts of 1 or 2 developments, but the cumulative impacts, the death by 1,000 cuts challenge that many of our watersheds are facing. And these 3 are specifically things that John will explore in a little more detail. And that will give us to what I would call winning condition number 9, which is this idea of continuous peer-to-peer learning and capacity building. That really, what we are in a new frontier. We're in a new world where many of the challenges, we have some ideas about what to do with, but we don't actually know for sure. And in fact, we need to learn from each other. We need to see what works in place, that we need to be undertaking pilots to test new tools, data systems, to figure out what the kinds of forms these institutions and the interplay between community input and community decision makers may ultimately take. This is a new area, of course, as we face these challenges in a modern world, and so we have to also sometimes learn from mistakes and errors, but accelerate the learning by having that interchange between those practitioners and those leaders who are at the forefront, seeing what works, what doesn't, and what we might do differently the next time. This is a manifest example of this approach. It's a little bit of a shameless plug, but this was a project that POLIS was involved in this last year, January 2014, called Watersheds 2014, where we did exactly that. We tried to bring together a mix of different organizations and groups and practitioners in the field to exactly have that conversation. This is a bit of a collage of what it looked like, but it was a theme. We tried to introduce some of the what we call big ideas, things like resilience thinking and attitudes around water, creating a watershed culture. We dealt with some of the really practical issues like social financing and the legal aspects of First Nations and water governance, also some of the legal changes that are happening on the landscape. We looked at developing some of the workshops. So how do you build those skill sets to deal with adaptive planning or traditional knowledge or the legal tools for watershed protection? And it really, in a sense, was modeled on some of the things that I saw successfully working in Ontario with the Laternal Conference series, where all the conservation authorities gather. It's a forum and a space where practitioners, leaders of all sorts, First Nations, municipal, provincial, regional district, federal government, community leaders could come together and exchange and build those networks. Our intention is for this to be an ongoing series in British Columbia. It's a national, the initial one was national, but also building some of the capacity by regions. So this is an ongoing theme. At that point, that's the 9 winning conditions, and I'd like to now move us through to where we might be going. So this is where we get to gaze in the crystal ball a little bit and talk about some of the next things. And in about 5 minutes, I'm going to hand it over to John. So I'm going to get John sort of prepared and ready for the handover that's going to come. The first thing is when we're talking about, you know, these next steps in the world that's unfolding before us, is how this watershed governance notion manifests on the landscape is very different place to place. And it really is critical to recognize that form follows function. And so in different places, the priorities, the functions, the things that will be done will be very different. And therefore, the form that these bodies or entities, these watershed governance units will take will be quite different. In some cases, it will be driven by First Nations. In other cases, it might be a regional district. Sometimes it'll be just a straight partnership. And in other cases, it might just be an informal stewardship society, the sort of gumboot folks who are out working in the watershed who are trying to inform the more formal decision making. So it takes a variety of different forms and formats. And we're not prescriptive at all on how that would look. But I do want to emphasize a few things. That collaborative watershed governance is hard to define what it is, but we can certainly have some insight on what it is not. The first is it's not a silver bullet solution. It is not sort of what we call the magic scale fix. If we just make all the decisions at the watershed scale, magically all the solutions will be there. So it's not an excuse to download. It really is about different kinds of decisions and, importantly, prioritizing watershed health and function in our decision-making matrix. It is not one size fits all. So be wary of the perfect model from elsewhere. And we do lots of time, we bring lots of guests in who talk about, say, what's happening in New Zealand or South Africa or Brazil or the European Union. And there's lots to learn about what has worked and what hasn't. But what we don't want to do is just take an example from elsewhere and just plug it in here, because it won't always function and the context is very different. It is not neat and tidy. It is ugly, requires hard work, and learn by doing. It takes time. It can take as much as 10 years sometimes to get these things launched. And that's critical. But that is the necessary infrastructure we're going to need. It is not quick and easy. But it really is fundamentally a tool to engage citizens, and really the goal is to help society live in nature's limits. No, Megan has not turned on the webcam. This is instead just a group of pictures that sets up what we think the ideal watershed governance arrangement is. And it really is just a group of mythical creatures. And those mythical creatures, just like our watershed governance perfect model, doesn't exist. I really want to emphasize that notion. The lack of sort of concrete examples is what makes some people have a challenging time dealing with this. They just simply want to bring in that expert from somewhere else who will serve it up on the silver platter. The opportunity instead is to get away from the notion of the perfect model being out there, and instead recognizing that using the winning conditions as a way to frame the challenge, that there's a whole host of ways it can manifest. And I'm going to leave you with this final thought. Water, not oil, will define the 21st century. And it really isn't actually that hard. It's hard to execute, but it's not hard to understand. It's prosaically simple, right? We need to use less and use what we take more productively. We need to learn to share and resolve conflicts. We need to leave enough water in the system to ensure healthy watersheds and proper function. We have to keep water on the landscape. And we need to change the public attitude that water is a free good. Instead, view it as a strategic natural asset and fundamentally a public trust. It requires citizens to engage, and perhaps, I'd like to think big, it's part of a new participatory governance movement. Hydro-citizenship, it has that kind of potential. I'm going to take a deep breath now. I'm going to let you all orient yourself, and I'm going to hand it over to John. So John, I think for ease here, I can happily move your slides along if you wish, but you're going to have to unmute yourself. I see you're still muted, so you're going to have to press *6 to unmute yourself, and then you can come in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'll let you move my slides.
Okay.
I'd like to say good morning to everybody, and I'd like to have a special good morning to my many friends who I see on the list of participants, and in particular my students or my ex-students from UBC over the number of years. My main contribution to this seminar is what I call a colour commentary from someone who's been in the government trenches for over 30 years, and the last 10 years of which I was at the deputy level. It's 10 years since I left government, so I'm not entirely up to date with the current government working and thinking. But I am trying to keep in touch, and I will touch on what I know. There are a number of people in the participants who are current government members who may add some information to my comments if I'm not up to date. So on the winning conditions, by the way, as a poke of fun, I have to get away from the fact that the only statistic that's greater than 93% of the people who consider water to be important is the 95% of people who are going to vote in the Scottish referendum tomorrow. So I thought you would appreciate that. And I'm not going to make a prediction. In terms of winning conditions, data systems and monitoring has been, to my knowledge, a significant improvement to government data systems over the last 10 years, starting in the work that I did in sustainable resource management, where we established data platforms across government and improved the quality control. The main concern is that field monitoring has been reduced because of the reduction in resources, and that's been identified by a number of audit reports by the Forest Practices Board and the Ombudsman's Office. So while data in terms of accessibility is improved, ongoing monitoring is reduced. Certainly a key condition for successful collaborative governance is a neutral or independent body to oversee how things are going and report out what's good and what's bad to the government sources. We've been calling for a transition of the current Forest Practices Board to a broader-based Natural Resources Practices Board, mainly because decision-making on the land under the provincial government has been concentrated in the new Ministry of Lands, Forests and Natural Resource Operations. And it made sense that the oversight be covering all aspects of the watershed, not just the forest resource space. I'm not up to date on this. Maybe some of my friends who are on the participant list can indicate where we stand on that, but certainly government has not yet changed policy to establish a board, and I think there's some resistance internally to shifting from the current practices board to a broader-based natural resources board. Cumulative effects analysis is something that has grown in importance in government over the last 10 years, largely because of the fragmented approach to land and resource development. So folks across the country, it's probably easiest to say that in any watershed there are three types of land use decisions. One is public land, where the decisions are made largely or entirely by provincial regulators, and to some extent federal under the Fisheries Act. There's private land, which is managed largely by local government through zoning and bylaws, etc. And in British Columbia, there's a middle ground called the private managed forests lands, which are actually private lands. But there's an agreement with the private managed landowners that the public resources on these lands will be managed through a set of regulations managed by the government. So it's a sort of a mixed bag. The problem with cumulative effects is that it's been difficult to coordinate the governance by the public sector, the local government sector, and the private managed forest lands so that they're aligned to deal with cumulative effects. So in the last few years, government has taken a lead to undertake some joint analysis for these players through a series of pilots to try and find out what is the nature of cumulative effects and how do we accountability to different players so that there is a common basis for analysing what's going on the land. It's a tricky area, and I'll be interested to take any comments that people have on what progress is being made elsewhere on that. Next slide. So the Water Sustainability Act, which was approved this spring, is now a new piece of legislation which is setting out a new course for water management in BC. And in my mind, it brings up to date the province with most of the other provinces across Canada that have brought in new legislation over the last 5 years. Although, in my mind too, the Water Sustainability Act has benefited by a review of that legislation. It's arguably one of the most forward-looking pieces of legislation tabled by British Columbia in the resources field for a number of years. Its implementation will have to align with the new integrated decision-making model. So what that means is that in the last 5 years, all decisions on public resources on the watershed are now made by one single ministry, the Forest, Lands and Natural Resources. Beforehand, it was made by 5 or 6 decision makers in different agencies, but the government brought these under one roof 5 years ago, and they're now in the process of developing an integrated decision-making model so that decision makers can make appropriate decisions over the various pieces of legislation, from forests to oil and gas to water and to recreation. So there has to be an alignment of the provincial resource objectives on the land as well as in water. And my friend Patrick Lucy, who may be in the participant list, I haven't seen him, is a great proponent that rivers are the integrators of the landscape. And so they are health models. If the landscape is poorly managed, the rivers will be suffering, and vice versa. So there's a real need to align provincial objectives on the Crown and private lands with the ones that are being proposed for water, so that the whole systems approach is taken to evaluating land management in watersheds. Finally, I have to talk a little bit about the government challenges, because this provincial government here has a commitment to balancing its budget. In doing so, it reduces the size of government in comparison to the amount of resources and revenues it gets, so that the budget is balanced. And over the last decade, there's been a reduction probably of 1/3 to 40% in total government resources, particularly in the resources field. So that has significantly reduced the on-the-ground capacity for government to take responsibility for the new approach. And the second thing is that the government does have a stewardship responsibility to balance the need for resource development and economic opportunity, and therefore resource revenues, with the need to protect the biodiversity and ecological performance of the watershed. And the new Water Sustainability Act is a real attempt to try and provide that balance. Next slide. So in our decision makers brief, which is a follow-up to the overall blueprint, we identified a number of action points that decision makers should be taking in order to improve water governance in BC over the next 5 to 10 years. And by decision makers, I go back to the model that I raised. These are public decision makers on public lands, local government decision makers on private lands, in between groups such as the Oil and Gas Commission and the Private Managed Forest Land Council, and of course First Nations. They're the ones who we're orienting these 6 or 7 action points to. So the first has been raised by Oliver, that is, there has to be a meaningful co-management with First Nations. The days of government ruling the roost and not engaging First Nations are long gone. And it's an interesting side comment that in the 35 years in government, I moved from a period of time at my beginning of my government life when there was zero contact with First Nations, to a point now where there are cases where First Nations have decision sharing responsibilities, such as the Great Bear Rainforest. So there's been a huge change in that, but in water there has to be an accommodation with First Nations. The second, there are a large number of regulations underpinning the Water Sustainability Act. On my count, it's at least 60 new regulations have to be drafted over the next several years. And they appear to be coming in two swathes. One on what I call the nuts and bolts of the legislation, which is water allocation for surface water, updating that, and for a whole new regime of groundwater regulation. And that takes a lot of time. Other aspects will include updating dam safety and regulations about activities in and about a stream. The second tier, which will take place over a longer period of time, maybe 2 to 3 years from now, are the ones that are of most interest to the POLIS group, which is the delegated decision-making powers to watershed government entities, the alignment of land and water objectives that I've made clear needs to take place to improve the health of watersheds, and some of the issues such as water sustainability planning and the development of these new water objectives tied to land. A third activity is this whole question of review of water fees. Right now, water fees are charged, with the exception of BC Hydro, simply to cover administrative costs of the ministry. And I have to comment that 10 years ago, I went to Cabinet 5 times to try and improve the regime for water fees, and I was thrown out 4 times in the process. So it's not an easy policy area for politicians to grasp, because it deals with the underpinning that people feel that water is essentially a free good and shouldn't be paying any or only minimum fees. And the growing feel that water is in fact a scarce resource and needs to be more charged in terms of its market and non-priced values. But I think, to me, the key is that in the fee review there is some additional resources in fees that can feed back to the Ministry of Environment to provide some additional resources to support the activities set out under the regulations under the Water Sustainability Act. So the Ministry of Environment's budget is currently flatlined for 3 years, which is inconsistent with taking on a major new initiative of water legislation. So either it's going to scavenge itself to find some costs, or it's going to have to find additional resources from fees that can be siphoned back into the ministry. And finally, on this slide, we're talking about the need to progress on these pilot watershed governance models, which include cumulative effects analysis. And we've identified some that we're working on in the Cowichan and the Okanagan. There's also in the northeast under the oil and gas development, and also in northwestern BC, where there's an overlap between mining, First Nations interests, tourism, and the whole LNG industry. Next slide. The other 3 areas that we're recommending is that there be at least a regular set, if not an annual meeting of practitioners along the lines of the Watersheds 2014. One of the points we make in winning conditions is that local citizens who are now engaged in watershed governance, and there are many of them across BC, meet and share their ideas, their decision-making tools, what works, what doesn't work, their frustrations, ways that they can improve their governance models. And I found that the Watersheds 2014 an extremely valuable learning exercise for people, some of whom were simply getting off the ground and meeting with people like the Columbia Trust, the Okanagan Basin Water Board, and the Cowichan Watershed Board, who have been at this for 5 or 6 years and are battle tested in terms of how to progress on collaborative governance. So it speeds up the learning process for people who are at the formative stages of working for their communities. I've mentioned before the need to align land and water-based objectives, and this should be led by the Forest Lands and Natural Resources Ministry. There are currently government objectives on the land. There are currently government regulations on private managed forest lands. There are currently inside local government various bylaws to try and set conditions for the development of riparian zones in around watercourses. In my mind, they're not all aligned, and the misalignment is causing a reduction in the health and functionality of watersheds. And a lot of work has to be done in the next 3 or 4 years to orientate these objectives so that they work. And it's a fundamental area where I think collaborative governments, through the combining of local government and local interests with provincial and federal governments and First Nations, can make a huge difference. And finally, we're talking about the need to strengthen independent oversight. And on the box on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a number of resources, reports that have been issued in the last few years, looking at the weaknesses of the current oversight, particularly with respect to so-called professional reliance. And as a government bureaucrat, I don't particularly have a problem with professional reliance as long as there's ultimately a government oversight on how well that's functioning. But taking away the government oversight leaves the hens with a free run in the hen house, and I think that is not in the best interest of British Columbia. And the Forest Practices Board issued a report about the weaknesses in the current community watersheds legislative fabric and the need for that to be improved because of the overlaps between jurisdictions. As I said, we in POLIS recommend a Natural Resources Agency board to become a new general oversight body, but I think it's a losing battle, but I'll welcome comments from anyone else who knows a bit more about that. Is that my last slide? Oh, I've got a few minutes to say about my overall observations. One is the implementation for WASA will take years. It's not a one-shot wonder. It'll take a minimum of 5 years, which is the mandate of this government to get through the actual changes in the regulations, and then it'll take another 5 years to embed these on the ground. So I see changes being incremental rather than immediately noticed. There's not going to be any blockbuster change in the way water is governed in the next few years. I believe that local interests, local governments, both local government itself and folk who are on this call who are currently engaged in collaborative models in Lake Windermere and Smithers and elsewhere, can have a significant influence on how effective these regulative processes will be, and I hope you participate in the shaping and development of the regulations. And finally, I'm a big supporter of what we call community ombudsmen or community stewards that step into the shoes of federal and provincial governments who are largely now absent with respect to oversight and monitoring what's going on in the field and being able to report areas where riparian zones are being damaged by poor practices and bring these to the attention of decision makers and try and make a change. So with these comments, Megan and Oliver, I will step back and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Oliver and John. Those were fantastic presentations. I think you've given folks a lot to think through and come up with some critical questions about. So I'll open it up to everyone in the chat box now. If you have a burning question, this is the time to ask it, and I'll pose it to Oliver and John. I'll also bring in our list of resources. So this is a list of reports and papers that Oliver and John have been referencing in their talks. So the first one is a link to our Blueprint for Watershed Governance in BC report. We have our Decision Makers Brief, which is a summary essentially of the blueprint, which we just released in August, a couple reports from the Forest Practices Board and the BC Ombudsperson, and then finally our Cowichan Watershed Board case study, which we also just released in August.
Just as people are putting in their questions and their thoughts, I thought one thing that might be worth just adding a little more color commentary to is the notion of watersheds. It's often an issue that certainly in the academic field there's lots of discussion because there's sort of what I would call pure sciences perspective where, a watershed is simply the high point of area of land that drains surface water along a natural ecosystem. When we talk about watershed governance in the context of the blueprint, we're talking of sort of a broad definition of watershed. So we're talking about the sophisticated interplay between the social, the ecological, and hydrological systems. Often internationally they talk about catchments or river basins, but we're talking spatially not just in that pure sense, but that land-water dynamic and the idea of a socio-ecological system. So for us, it can really cover a range of scales, and we're sort of overly particular in the sense that a watershed might, for example, in this governance context, talk about a larger basin, like the Fraser Basin, or as a sub-watershed in such a big system. So the Thompson might be, in our sense, talked about as a watershed governance unit that makes some sense, even though it's a subset of the larger Fraser Basin. Or, on the other way of looking at it for us is, along the coastal regions, there might be a clustering of small sub-watersheds that align with a given population that sort of forms a freshwater community or culture, as is common if you look in the BC coast where communities, First Nation traditional territories might span multiple smaller stream systems. So we take that sort of broad interpretation around what a watershed might be in the context of governance. We're not just talking purely ecosystem lines here.
Great, thanks for that, Oliver. So we have some questions filtering in. First one came from Katrina Siglock. She's asking, what is the distinction between the functions of the Ministry of Environment and Water versus forest lands and natural resources and water? So I guess that's open to either Oliver or John.
Well, I'll take a crack at that. MOE essentially is the policy. Ministry of Environment is the policy arm of the environment legislation. It provides the direction on developing the legislation and the regulations. The Ministry of FLNRO is actually the operational side of government. It actually issues all of the licenses and approvals. So water licenses, approvals for activities in and about a stream, and then the riparian assessment regulation are all done by FLNRO. So the difference is one between policy and operations.
All right, and we have another compare and contrast question, this one from Rick Simpson. He'd like to differentiate between capacity building and cumulative impacts. So that might be more relevant for John.
Well, the way I define cumulative impacts is the accumulation of the results of many activities on the land base as it's manifested in the health of the watershed and the riparian zone. So in the past we have uncoordinated decisions by people building roads, building mines, making decisions on land tenure and forestry. And while each one has operated within its separate regulatory framework, when you look at the results on the ground, there's an accumulation of interactions that causes a deterioration in the health of watersheds. So the idea of cumulative impact analysis is to understand the interactions and to coordinate decisions so that these unintended consequences become known and managed. Capacity building, in my mind, is more about increasing the capability of collaborative planning groups who are acting in watersheds, such as the Columbia Basin Trust or the Okanagan Basin Board or the Lake Windermere people, by giving them tools and resources and even doing some monitoring to improve the way they help the governance process.
Thanks, John. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to add on that, Oliver?
Nope.
No, you're good. All right. Let's move ahead then. So we had a question from Ian Steffen. He's wondering what the current state of the Water Sustainability Act regulation development is. He said, I guess he heard from the Ministry of Environment that public input would be part of it, but he hasn't seen any sign of that to date.
And I can offer a little thoughts here. I think the way the ministry would like to see it unfurl, I guess, is by April 2015 is what John called the nuts and bolts, or the Tier 1 elements, which basically, I mean, the Water Sustainability Act's primary function is to allocate water and to recover some fees or associated with that. And so to put that into place, they want to have a couple of the core regulations related to the new groundwater allocation regime, the updating of the surface water allocation regime, including, arguably the fee schedule, which relates to water pricing, and the dam safety elements. So that's sort of Tier 1, and that's likely to happen in 2015. I suspect that those, when Ian talks about public consultation, I don't suspect there'll be a widespread public consultation on those elements because they're both mostly mechanical in nature. Where there will be public consultation in that context is once the groundwater allocation regime is in place, there's in essence this moment in time where you have to grandfather all the existing uses of groundwater. So there's many people, I've heard over 30,000 different wells or users of groundwater across the province. They will now have to have a license to be in compliance. And so at that moment, there's a whole bunch of licenses that will have to come into effect. Any of those licenses that have the potential to impact on First Nations rights or titles will need consultation and accommodation. I suspect they'll use sort of the more traditional legal test, but basically there'll have to be some discussion about the passing of those allocation and licenses. So those won't be, I would say, widespread public consultations, but those will be very sectoral-based conversations. The same with the pricing and fee schedule. That's basically by the various end users, agriculture, industry, municipalities, who are the ones who will be most directly affected when this new regime comes in. So again, those will be very sectoral with some role for advisors. Now, in the Tier 2, when we're talking about the regulations, for example, related to water objectives, a critical area of interest for us is around beneficial use, defining what beneficial use is, or dealing with environmental flows or the critical flows or the water sustainability planning. Those regulations I would expect to be much more public in nature, where there will be sort of a discussion paper or a premise put forward, and then there'll be a wider variety of groups, not only of stakeholders and those impacted, but also more public dialogue, which, to be fair to the process led by government, they during the build-up of the Water Sustainability Act, they ran an extremely effective and an extremely open process on engaging and soliciting input and making sure that that was all public. So they actually created a kind of province-wide dialogue that I've rarely seen anywhere related to that. So I think that's where you will see much more of that public kind of dialogue. I hope, Ian, that answers your question a bit. I'm happy to add a bit more if you want to add a follow-up question.
Great, thanks, Oliver. Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Ian. We can move into a question from Sarah Thomas. She's asking, when looking to move to more comprehensive conversations around aligning land and water objectives, how do we address the vested interests of private companies who currently drive land use impacts in the area and don't necessarily want to have a conversation about the competing benefits that are at play?
So I think this is a great question, because this is really where we see the interface of the two themes of legal scholarship, right? There's this notion of legal laws, and then there's social laws. And I think what it gets interesting here is it is clear that in the water entitlements regime, which is the legal laws part, there are some constraints. So even though in the imagination of some of those, what they would consider rights holders, they think their water license is a right, It is not. There's a limit. They have a right to use, and even that is constrained. And there's a couple of constraints related to that. One is this notion of beneficial use, which has never been very well defined in the province of British Columbia. It has historically meant you're just using it for some kind of economic use and you're paying your administrative fees. If you do that, you have the right to the water. Use of water, not ownership of the water. It is indicated by the current colonial legal regime to be owned by the Crown. This is, of course, is contested by many First Nations. That's kind of a separate conversation. But this idea that these private interests hold these rights is not necessarily true, because these rights, or I much prefer to use the word entitlements, are subject to a number of factors. One is beneficial use, which I understand in the Tier 2 of regulation development will include important provisions about what industry standards are. So just because you have an entitlement to, say, irrigate a certain crop, you have to use it at a certain amount that's appropriate. So you can't waste water while you're doing it. So it will promote some conservation. Also, other entitlements will be limited by, for example, the critical flow regime in the legislation makes it explicit when a river or stream is subject to certain drought conditions, all entitlements will potentially be frozen until that issue has passed. There's other, and I call them off-ramps for the first-in-time, first-in-right system. So fit for off-ramps. There's a whole bunch of new and interesting fit for off-ramps that exist in the legislation. The other one, of course, relates to objectives. So I think there's an important, broader social conversation that will have to happen about this reconciling of what it is, to what extent is the allocation that they hold a right or an entitlement subject to a number of factors. I don't think necessarily it will go easily or smoothly at first, but I think over time it will become very apparent that there is going to have to be some compromise as we try and align these uses to ensure the overall functioning and health of the watershed.
I'd just like to add a comment, because I know Sarah, she's one of my ex-UBC students, and I think she's also applying her question to the role of private players on the public land base, particularly the private managed forest companies. And my understanding, because I've met with the private managed Forest Council members, that they are very anxious to collaborate on this development of regulations and governance models on watersheds. In fact, they've done one example of a cumulative effects analysis, I think, in a watershed called China Creek, which is a domestic watershed to Port Alberni, and found out that there were many actors on that watershed affecting water use and land use, both in the managed by the public sector and managed by the private sector, and they weren't all aligned. So it attests to the complexity of cumulative effects analysis.
Great, thanks, John. So going to another level of government here, federal government. Oliver Jumville has a question. He's wondering, what role do you think federal government ought to play in terms of water management moving forward? So how could it address the various gaps being in knowledge or in monitoring? So what's the role for federal government here?
Again, I think this is it's a good conversation. There's obviously lots of knowledge or lots of work been done on understanding what the constitutional requirements are. There's different heads of power, and it's very clear that the federal government can play a wide range of roles that they have sort of historically not done particularly well, but over time, I think have diminished. I mean, the most obvious is the role in fisheries and habitat protection and the changes to the Fisheries Act. I think the sort of obvious pieces that matter probably most are around fish and habitat, transboundary, baseline ecological climate and hydrologic monitoring. The scientific aspect is really critically important and has wide application. Of course, there's, in Canada, in our federated system, even in BC, even though the province is mostly responsible for land, there is water management on federal crown lands, federal parks, and in First Nations reserves. There's also the compliance and enforcement roles. And of course, when we're talking about government-to-government negotiations with First Nations, the federal government would inevitably play a role. So those are some of the aspects that I think are most obvious. But to me, just in a short answer sort of way, is the federal government has a potentially really powerful role on not only transboundary, but the science aspect in really driving some of the important science, the knowledge systems, ensuring that we really have a sort of common approach. And I've done some work nationally around this, and what you often see is some of the data, even though different regions or provinces are gathering some information, it is a little bit like apples and oranges. And so they can do a lot for that harmonization and the sort of base knowledge systems that we would all benefit from not only understanding how a given watershed may change over time, but how a given watershed might compare with other similar watersheds across the nation. And as a result of this sort of what I would call gap in capacity is, certain groups like WWF with their freshwater assessment programs have had to sort of step in, or Living Lakes have had to step in on some of this monitoring and knowledge system approach. And I don't know if the capacity exists in civil society and amongst these advocacy-based groups to necessarily fill this very important and we would argue really critical objective knowledge base.
But I'd like to add to this, because Tina also had a question about monitoring that relates to Oliver's question. In my mind, as I said before, local entities, local government and community groups need to step in and develop capacity to actually do some field monitoring. And this is occurring, I know, in the Kootenays, but I believe that the regional district of Nanaimo has developed through some funding that it's obtained to do some monitoring and revaluation of groundwater resources. So there are now examples where local groups, other than the federal and provincial governments, are stepping into the void and taking on some of these responsibilities. And my recommendation is you don't need new legislation to do this. You simply need to understand what are the priorities and work with other players and start doing this kind of work.
I'm just going to follow up with John's comment because I see in the chat box that Tina was also asking about what other kinds of opportunities exist for these community-based groups. And I think another sort of complexion to this is obviously the knowledge base. But a critical thing that we're seeing, and I think if you look at the Cowichan Watershed Board case study, is the role of civil society or community-based interest to really elevate the importance of the watershed or the home water's health element. And that can be, on the one hand, sort of an advocacy position, and you see good examples of that increasingly. Water Wealth or One Cowichan are such groups that form and really elevate the citizens' interest, and it communicates well to the local and regional politicians who can understand why this is a priority. They sort of are bombarded by a number of priorities that come at them from all angles. So elevating the role or importance of water in that sort of community dialogue way is critically important. And I would argue for a lot of the innovative collaborative watershed governance pieces that will eventually evolve, in my opinion, to some of these more formal elements, they often are sort of catalyzed or sparked by the engaged community-based groups. So you have to identify what some of the problems are in the watershed and also who some of the key players are needed to drive that solution. So those community groups can often act as that informal connective tissue that connects across the different scales from the federal to the provincial to the First Nations, and even reaching out. And the province and the federal governments have been very weak at being able to reach out to First Nations and engage them in that partnership. And sometimes it takes civil society to kind of build that priority, to bring that engagement, to force that engagement. And it can be challenging, but that's a really critical role, that catalyzing. And, related to that, we did a study, it's called State of the Water Movement in British Columbia. It's on our website, where we looked at it and we see that there's, upwards of 200 such community groups exist currently in BC, and they're growing all the time, and they have that appetite and interest in moving down that scale of watershed governance, from just the gumboots activities to the persuasion to the influencing formal decision makers and maybe even an interest in some of the more formal control. So that, to me, is really one of the critical aspects.
Thanks for that, Oliver. So we had a question come in from Jenny Fraser. She's wondering, given that watersheds in BC vary in scale, for larger watersheds, what do you see as the responsibilities of upstream watersheds to the whole watershed? So what's the responsibility of the upstream reaches to the downstream reaches, essentially?
Well, in international law, there's a standard premise of sort of a fairness or equality, where you basically are obligated to ensure that the water leaves your area in a way that doesn't impact the downstream users. I think it's a very good notion, and I think that's probably a basic starting point. I think that the challenge when you have a very complex or big system like the Fraser, you really need to almost create another nested system where you have that sort of whole basin-wide perspective, where you can begin to articulate some of these objectives, and this is captured in law around this notion of riparian rights, where basically you have to leave water in an unaltered state once you've used it. You don't take enough water, or you don't take so much water that the downstream users don't have access to water, or you don't leave it in a polluted way so that they are impacted. And that's a very human-centric approach, of course, but that to me would be the minimum starting point. Of course, in an ideal world, when we're moving towards ecological governance type regimes, we're talking about maintaining the function and health of watersheds. So we're beginning to recreate those attributes of what are healthy watersheds, and that might be as sophisticated as having communities with extensive green roofs and reduced impermeable surfaces, so you begin to recreate or reinforce or protect that natural hydrologic cycle, and also ensuring that you're really conscious of what chemicals and what pollutants go in the water, where you actually reverse the onus, where you go from this current Canadian approach, which is we can put in whatever we want until someone proves there's an impact, to flipping it around to saying, well, you can only put something in if you can prove that the impact is basically nominal. So, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about keeping watersheds in functioning systems, and that means at all elements, up and down the watershed.
All right,
Megan,
thanks, Oliver. Oh, go
Megan,
ahead, John.
just a couple of points, because Jory's bugging me about a question on municipal level, but just on the whole watersheds, we do have the Fraser Basin Council, which was established as a non-profit society to look overall at the Fraser, and then it's broken it down into constituent parts by having subunits in the Thompson and the Chilcotins to deal with specific issues. And the other item of that, which people are aware of on this phone call, is the Columbia Basin Treaty, and the review of that treaty are currently underway, and the important role that the Columbia Basin Trust is taking to work with its colleagues in the south of the border to try and come up with a more holistic approach to the governance of the Columbia. But on municipal levels, I just wanted to point out that in the work that Oliver and I and others have done in the Cowichan Valley Regional District, the key recommendation coming out is that municipal governments, both the regional district and municipalities, have many more tools existing in their current tool bags than they're using to manage water and water-related land effectively. So there's a need for a review of water-centric decision-making by local government to see what it can do under its existing capacity and legal powers in the Community Charter and the Local Government Act to improve the way it manages the resource. And in my mind, almost every local government can do more with under existing laws and regulations than they're currently doing.
All right, thanks, John. I think we'll leave it there for our question period.
Well, Megan, I'm wondering if we might, because in the past what we've done is, for those who are interested, we usually tack on maybe 5 or 10 more minutes if people want to stay on. I'm certainly happy to work through some of these questions to at least give them some input and maybe even following up as needed. But we might add a few more minutes if people are willing, and those who can't can, of course, check out.
Sure, yeah, that works.
So
We had a nice long question here from Megan Pelso. We can go to that one if you like.
I'm just not sure where I'm seeing that. Okay, because I see a few that are up at the top here from Rick Simpson under Jody Walsh's question.
Okay.
It came prior. I just wonder if you you see that
about
one?
watershed and landscape scale planning. Would you like to go to that one?
I just think because they come in the order, I just thought we might address them in the order to give people a chance to get their answers.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I'm just scrolling down on this one.
John, it might be most appropriate for you because he asked about the 8-year-long LRMP process, consuming a huge public and volunteer goodwill and resources, and then it just faded away over the successive government regimes. How do you ensure that we maintain this public volunteer effort and trust are not sort of lost? You might have.
Well, Rick, that's an extremely good question because I was heavily involved in both the LRMPs and the landscape scale planning, and during the period 1995 to 2005, there was a highly active government program to complete strategic plans at the land and resource level and also more operational plans at the landscape level. And I thought that was probably the most advanced attempt at biodiversity and ecosystem planning that we've ever had in BC. Unfortunately, it died on the vine as a result of a switch in government policy towards a focus on natural resource development and extraction, and a shift away from protecting and maintaining ecological and biodiversity values. And it was replaced by other failed attempts such as the conservation policy. So I don't have a full answer to the fact that some people put an awful lot of time into these landscape and LRMPs and feel that they've been shortchanged by the fact that they've not been maintained. And I think it's another example of where more effective community groups taking over more control and responsibility for the watersheds have to challenge provincial government employees and say, look, we need to re-engage some of these processes because we can't get the values that we treasure on the table unless you come back to the table with new approaches to these landscape level planning.
Sounds good, John.
So the next two questions we had after Rick were to deal with Aboriginal title and rights to water, so we can go to those. The first one was from Harry Swain. So he's asking Oliver, with respect to the licensing of existing groundwater takings, is it your underlying assumption that Aboriginal title may apply to water, either surface or ground? And then Gary Leering, right after him, asked, given the need for greater First Nations role in decisions, is there any consensus on where territory boundaries are for securing such endorsements? So are First Nations in agreement as to what band has the final say?
And so I'll tackle Harry's question first. A good question as always, Harry. I think it's not my assumption. I think the courts are increasingly revealing. So we have two veins of thinking here, right? Under colonial law, that may or may not be contested, and I would argue it's not actually anymore. And certainly under Indigenous law, there's no doubt about it, right? So Crown ownership is totally contested. But under even colonial law, we see the recent Halalt decision, where although it ultimately was appealed, it was related to the relative merits of the environmental assessment process. The lower court component indicated that groundwater was likely part of title, especially under reserves as it connects. So that's sort of what I would call sort of evidence item number one. And the recent Chilcotin decision while not explicitly talking about water, again implies or alludes to the notion that water and groundwater, I would assume, but certainly surface water, is intimately related to the notion of title. So I would say it's not necessarily my assumption, but it's an emerging assumption even in colonial law that Aboriginal title applies to water, both surface and ground. How that manifests exactly obviously is still an open question, because I don't think people really understand the full implications of the Chilcotin decision. Although on that note, shameless plug alert, POLIS with the Faculty of Law and a number of other partners, including the Center for Global Studies, are doing a panel discussion next week on the Chilcotin decision, and we have a number of very interesting panelists. One who was the lead lawyer for the Chilcotin Nation, and some scholars who are working in the field who we are challenging them, to speculate a little bit about what the implications might be for water. So, Harry, I hope that answers your question. On the question of boundaries, I think that's a much tougher question, and I don't think there's an easy answer, because I think like all social spaces and boundaries, there is going to be some element of contestation. There's going to be some discussion. It's not always going to be easily drawn on a map, and I don't think that needs to be so. I don't think that needs to stop a much more of a partnership-oriented approach, because in some nations and overlapping nations, there may be some discussion about what exactly the boundaries are, but I don't have a lot of knowledge in that area.
Thanks,
John,
Oliver.
did you want to add anything there?
No, I'm fine with that. I'm not sure whether we addressed Megan's question.
Yeah, she's next up. It's a great question. So Megan's from Lake Windermere Ambassadors. She says it's similar to Shawnigan Lake. They host many second and seasonal homeowners. She says the lake is busiest during the summer season, and there's a smaller local core group that remains invested in the stewardship throughout the year. And her question that she wants to open up are, what are some of the ways to reach the transient population that make up a substantial portion of the lake use and inspire non-transient or committed stewardship on the water body? It's a great question.
And Megan, again, is a former student of mine, and I'm glad she's got this job in Lake Windermere. There's not an immediate answer, but it is an issue that transcends a number of watersheds. For example, Green Lake in the Chilcotin area also has a large summer population, which is fouling its own nest by having inadequate septic tank management, and so there's a fair bit of water pollution in the lake, and it's growing eutrophication and algae development. So it attests to the need to have these community forums that we are recommending occur once a year or so, where like-minded groups can come together and identify techniques that attract the attention of some of these transients, get local people who have got some leadership capability to try and identify them and use them as a basis for rallying their peers. But I can't be more explicit than that, other than to say that it's a shared issue throughout a number of lakes and watersheds in BC.
Sounds good.
Great, thanks. So we have a question from Jenny Fraser. She's wondering, for both of you, what are your thoughts about the process of shifting to this model of watershed governance? And are there elements that should be set in place first, or is there a light version?
I'm going to maybe make a bit of an executive decision here, because I think this is a big topic, and it's something that we will certainly be exploring throughout the series as we look at some of the more applied examples. So let me re-emphasize that in the remainder of the series, and Megan will talk a bit about our next one, but we're going to be dealing with the topics of co-governance, of sustainable funding, of cumulative impacts, and some of the regional district things or local government pieces that are happening on the ground and what we can learn from them. I think that will be the space where we can more thoughtfully talk through what a light or what a staged approach might be. I mean, the simple answer is there is no easy answer. I don't think we don't have a formula of how this works best, except for if you have an urgent need in your region and you can rally a number of interests, not just the environmental community, but the others, First Nations, local government, you can often catalyze some progress. The winning conditions play a role, but there's no way of knowing what order they need to happen.
I'd just like to add one comment on that, and that is to Jenny, is that when we discussed the so-called light and devolved version with the Cowichan people yesterday, it was clear in my mind that quite a lot of activity can be improved by collaborative governance without any changes in legislation. It simply needs either a better coordination of existing laws and regulations between the public sector and private sector regulators, or it needs some oversight and monitoring. But the actual devolution of powers, i.e. local groups taking on activities currently the responsibility of provincial government, for example, allocating water licenses or managing riparian rights on streams through a delegated model, that can take place in about 5 years' time, when it becomes pretty clear that a local group needs more control levers in order to protect its interests on the watershed, and that leaving that to a bifurcated system with federal and provincial and local government regulators isn't simply going to work, and it needs to be unified through delegating formal control in legislation and regulations to a single level of government. And that's the magic of what I see in the Water Sustainability Act. It offers that prospect.
So I think in the interest of time, we should try and wrap up with, I think there's one or two questions, Megan. Is that correct? And then we can close, we can begin to set up the landing gear and close up our webinar for today.
Yeah, that's right. So let's make this question from Nelson Jatel our last question of the day. So he's asking, are there any works underway to explore traditional knowledge governance processes used historically in BC? I gave the example of the Inaukin in the Okanagan. And how may we learn to apply them to wicked problems we collectively face on the new Anthropocene era waterscape?
I love the question from Nelson. I don't know of anything exactly on point here, but I do know, well, we're part of a project on Indigenous water laws. That's a multi-year, more traditional academic kind of program run out of the University of Victoria's Faculty of Law, led by Val Napoleon and Deb Curran, where I imagine some of these aspects related to governance will begin to be included, but it's more focused around the Indigenous law basis as a parallel to the colonial legal system that we're more familiar with around water law. And I think that's what will touch on some of that. That's certainly something, Nelson, when we see you next, we'll talk in more detail with Deb about as well. That's just in the proposal stage, and we're just trying to get it launched.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. So I'll advance the slide here and just say a big thank you first to our speakers. That was a very stimulating conversation about watershed governance and the next steps for BC. I'll just plug our next webinar. So as Oliver said, we usually do 5 webinars in each Creating a Blue Dialogue season. And our next one will be on Wednesday, November 26th. And this webinar will focus on First Nations and co-governance, drawing from that specific winning condition outlined in the Blueprint report. And our confirmed speakers will include Dina Matchin, who's from the First Nations Fisheries Council, Eli Enns from the ICCA Consortium, who's a POLIS affiliate, and Meryl Ann Fair from the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. So I've got the link there to our YouTube page where we archive all of our previous webinars. So you can view all of them there, and I'll be circulating the link to this webinar once it's posted online. That's likely going to be in the next 2 weeks. And for any of you that don't get our webinar invitations, please just send me a note, either to my email address or to Laura's, and I can add you to our list to receive those. So I think with that, we can close it up. So thank you so much for attending, everyone, and I look forward to being in touch